these should be my final thoughts on the Journal of the Church of the Hermetic Sciences and the Ordo Templi Astartes, the Seventh Ray, Book 4, Omnibus, the Violet Ray. Well, not my final thoughts, but my final things that I'm thinking about this book that I'm sharing in this program. Because certainly, as I said, I'm going to use it more in depth. And of course, in these 3 programs, I'm not reading things. On page 168, we are reminded what this group is. And it's about personal divinity, as it's called, and blending in with the harmony. Of course, the idea is not per se in the way of others must worship you as if you're a god of one of these cults of old, right? And we see before that the ceremonies of this group, at least the seasonal ones, are based around the Rosh Hashanah tablets that were discovered. And it's connected with legends of Merlin and Solomon and, these other secondary religious traditions, you could say. And it's just fine if somebody goes off and starts their own order in regards to this group. Of course, if they're going to have a chartered order, it certainly helps to work completely the system rather than starting one's own thing, right? On page 169, we have this idea of Raphael as Raphael as a cloud rider. We remember that with the fall equinox, we have this representation of something in the heavens, the crater constellation and all that. We have the raven, and remember all those Goetia birds before all those snakes, right? And of course, the raven and the crow are amongst those. One eventually has to reconcile the various doctrines and practices and experiences and stuff that one has. Mikkel has a flaming wand and whip adorned with sort of a chakra system, and then you have the dual at the shoulders, right? And the magical altar is positioned to capture the sunset, and certain, or is it the sunrise? Certain things about using directions in ritual are certainly important. There is importance in exploring the outside space, but the inner space has a lot of universals. And more than cultural diffusion, there is the inner space as the source for technology and how cultures were the way they were. And to discount the ancient aliens sort of thinking, there is spiritual experience too, and some of that guides in ways beyond what our minds and our bodies are coming up with, are certainly doesn't have to pick up the flaws of such. Of course, it matters what entity you speak to, right? And it matters what you do with that. The Church of the Hermetic Sciences, OTA, restricted their role as far as the OTO is concerned, and certain grades, it said, is, it was limited to in what it enacted out in those terms. Freedom is, in a sense, illusory, because sometimes things are put in a more free faction and it prevents people from actually being as creative and individualistic or in one way or another. We need to distinguish between science and scientists, between propaganda and real news. We need to distinguish between the filter of society and the filter of ourselves, and the actual book of ourselves, the actual book of nature, the actual revealed books. Because you definitely see that in Bible commentaries, right? Is you see all this stuff in the footnotes and maybe even amongst the text that isn't even in the Bible, and they change parts of the Bible from time to time. What the LDS and the Seventh Day Adventists and the Christian Scientists, they refuse to use any of the newer stuff in the Bible. Some of them have even gone back and said, well, we want Greek. And if it didn't happen in Greek, there's 10,000 variants in the New Testament, and it's not all, it's almost entirely not dialectical stuff. Yeah, if it didn't even happen at that period, they didn't want that in their Bible. So they tried to base their Bibles off of Greek. And there really isn't any criticism about the Bible translations as much as the King James, because, of course, for other issues, there's other more serious issues, but the King James Version of the Bible was slanted in some spots. Like, for example, they minimized the impact of the condemnation of homosexuality, even though, for example, you had the Greek word porneusē, which means any sex act outside of marriage. Not just, vaginal sex or something like that. So it encompassed everything. Adultery was adultery. It wasn't, was it technical virginity or technical, that stuff doesn't fly in the biblical language. That's been an issue in America, I guess, but that's how they opened it up. Is at first they had that, and now it's like there are even churches where people openly admit, not confession, and they want to deal with it, but they openly admit to all sorts of things. I have certainly considered whether or not things were as I was told. And sometimes it was, but the way they said it, you don't interpret it right. Like, if you don't know the news, it's like, the most accurate news channel was known for being like ridiculous and all sorts of stuff, but it's like it's just not got more inaccurate, and the other ones have got a whole lot more inaccurate. But for the most part, it's not inaccuracy, it's just the way they say it. It sounds a lot different than it actually is. It's important sometimes that ceremonies be for members only, and particularly a 7 gates, 7 veils sort of ceremony. That it's important that people are known to be able to handle themselves in such situations. I've been open to having people present to my rituals that I don't know are trained or whatever. But I do need to lay down some groundwork or whatever. Page 189 is like a rebirth through an eclipse by the power of law and desire at the behest of those who have crossed the gulf in their return to the truly apostle. Let us remember that pomegranates are a symbol of the parts of consciousness work, and analysis is just one of the functions along the way. There is beyond and before what has been done with our structure of consciousness, our ego, and what the ego is itself, and the projections of the different roles that we take on or have been shaped by are those stages of development. 197 is a joke about the pain of restraining your desires. Existence is both pain and pleasure. And rather than taboos of there being certain aspects of life, we got to become aware of ourselves. It doesn't mean we seek out the illegal fantasies or whatever, but it does mean we realize those parts of ourselves that can possibly indulge in things. And if we're having the direction towards things that we shouldn't be taking part in, we figure out how they're going to be productive. And we also realize that what is good for us is not necessarily what is good for others. It seems to me almost that the illustration on page 202 is a Sabian in the Islamic empires of old, doing his rituals with the positions of planets and stars. Like the Necronomicon, Arabian Nights displays some archetypes of the magician and the magic that can be done. The desires, the aspects of being can be directed towards thought, or other expression, or not having those thoughts or not having those expressions. And certainly those groups that actually did carry on their tradition or reinterpretation or something, don't want a mere dry mechanical Western interpretation of their traditions, are what their traditions may refer to or represent. Because the New Age movement isn't exactly a survival of the old ways. It represents things, though. Percival, Wolfram, other such Teutonic myths did take on a Christian character, but there is more to it than that. And chivalry is actually the service nobility ethic, but of course this clothed a mystical quest, a mystical development aspect to it, and the various elements of these stories that line up and the ones that don't line up do talk about that consciousness work in a way, but of course making it a real world practice. Page 211 shows how the Kabbalah tree and the 7-part Kundalini uprising can be combined. Some think of the higher states, as they would be called, as revelation from beyond the self. But at the very least, it is how we awaken parts of ourselves and understand through those perceptions and sensations. The illustration showing the 3rd part of Freedom as a Two-Edged Sword kind of shows a Masonic temple, but it's not a Masonic temple by some things that are there. We are reminded to not over-moralize or genderize the aspects of nature. Now, in sacred plays and stuff like this, like we're talking about being done here, that's not what we mean, but this being stuck up on those sorts of details is not what we're after. We are to free ourselves from the control of these various other created beings that are doctrines and actions are not so much under their directing. Now, certainly there are laws of the land that you need to follow, but mere social custom. I've even had a police officer tell me that, well, you're not normal. It's like, yeah, nothing wrong with that. Oh, he very strongly disagreed, but temple openings place yourself in an active role within a sense of cosmology. And we can connect that and associated operations with our sense of destiny, that we can give our lives meaning, and then those clay-born spirits would not be, would not have that sense of hopelessness. Maybe there's some entity in there with us, or entities that are holding us back. And the practiced magician may be able to see them leave. On page 220, is that a Babylonian offering incense in the daylight as a way of adorning? Now, I fill up my books, my journals with what can be meant by the incense that I have offered. Some initiations need to be outside. And as far as particular groups, it's important that groups uphold a sense of that people can do the work within the group to be enlightened within the confines of perceptions. Then we have sort of a geometry lesson with the trisecting of a pentagram. And of course, if we play around with the angles and all that of the symbols, it gives it dimension at the very least. It is for each to learn to determine the validity of their experience or their interpretations or uses of their experience. Because whether others are better at the interpreting of dreams or the development of certain psychic abilities or not, it is up for each individual to, take on of these things for themselves, because if they don't, no one else believing differently is going to do anything for them. The fourth part of Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword has an illustration that reminds us that sensuality is laid bare, but it's guarded by emotions. And to the side, thought. And of course, can be in the terms of the spiritual. And spiritual is not just whether you've decided your joy or you're finding your bliss, as Joseph Campbell would said. It's not just, it's similar to Crowley's true will, but your Sukhavati, it's not just something where you just do what you like or something. I would disagree with Dr. Valerian in saying that men seek a woman less than themselves. You can, man or woman, they can be with somebody that encourages and inspires them towards something greater. And I mean inspired not in the sense as they necessarily give them, revelation or whatnot. But, we do hear of certain prophets like Muhammad who had revelation while in their wives. But gendered roles can be a bit different. I mean, and you should value in a choice for a spouse the different types of gender roles that they have. And if you share in and encourage each other rather than this war of the sexes that they keep trying to push on us, one of the things that happens is that it redeems both people, or at least keeps them from falling. Now, in regard to the 22 Trumps, they do have a magical alphabet. And this magical alphabet has been in use by the Ordo Templi Astartes since 1973. And this alphabet has its attributes. There's specific letters, colors and stuff that they use. And as we see, it's very close to what some people are going to call Phoenician. Divination is not, oh, I've shuffled a deck of cards, I can tell the future, or some stuff like that, or, some other type of thing. It is working out those forces within us and a reaction to those forces. And it's a way of personal psychotherapy. It's a way of employing narrative. It's a way of encouraging discipline beyond mere lists, and perhaps coming up with ideas to refine those lists of physical and other disciplines. Just like one might be able to say that the Talmud was the, that we know of, was the response to the Islamic books of law, and the Hadith books, and the Tafsir books, and the Sirah books. We also see some stuff starting in Sufism, and then we have the historical appearance of Kabbalah. And so we have to watch out for the sort of nonsensical sort of Kabbalah books. It's like, oh, it's like, okay, maybe that made sense for them, but, acting like this is like actual Kabbalah tradition. Some of it is quite overblown. And of course, there is the confusing of Christian doctrines in with Kabbalah, although, as we've seen from Gershon Sholem and stuff, there's certainly a lot to be said for what is there. Oh, the alchemical mass. Well, I mean, the elemental mass, it relates to our life, our light, our love, our substance, our spirit, our existence. Sacrifice shouldn't be out of a sense of, ooh, I'm going to do the forbidden. No, it should be towards an experience, that you're actually giving something up or putting something fully in a cause, that you're employing some of the difficult or disturbing things in life to an end. And we should be trying to give ourselves other states of consciousness at times. We can learn things from the magical use of the alphabet. We can think of how certain of these symbols and their combinations no longer get us to think about, what they look like and what they look like in their combinations, but certain groups. Now, this isn't really the scope of this here, but the example used of the SS, well, I don't think the NSDAP really changed any of the symbols to sinister. And that's why esoteric Hitlerism has not only its inherent power of its symbols, but it also has this power of, we're operating a power that others, so this persona against it. Of course, I'm not saying that we need to engage in esoteric Hitlerism or neo-Nazism or anything like that. I'm just saying that a lot of it doesn't come from what people think it comes from. It's sort of like a punk thing, I guess. And now for some, wearing an Israeli flag is a punk thing because, well, they know how offensive some things that government takes part in is. And it has nothing to, the opposition to that government it's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I mean, that exists, but that's virtually actually the pro-Semitic people, the pro-Jewish people even, but that's not that's a side point, not really related to that. But I'm just thinking that, because I was thinking about one of the examples and how, people demonize that, and they have the dignity not to bring up those associations, but I'm not saying it's undignified for me to bring up it. I'm just saying that some people are like, all right. But my channel's not necessarily for those who are going to be too hasty for judgment. Of course, I hope that they benefit from what they encounter. And Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword and some other things. They have, illustrations, illustrations are pretty good for the Church of Hermetic Science stuff. That pulp fiction sort of persona, crosses over into a lot of this. Before that, there's the mention of how this group here worked with other neo-pagan groups, because they want, not only want to develop and, I never thought of that sort of ideas about raising children as, non-Christians in a Christian world, of course. Now in America, most people are not Christian. I mean, people will say Merry Christmas or Happy Easter, but do they believe in Christianity? No. A large percentage of people don't even have religion. Christianity is the number one type of religion in the country. But part of the being open to, raise your kids as something other than Christian is part of what made it possible. And freedom is for people on all levels of society. One thing that we have is this pulling at sentiments. And certainly the propagandists have brainwashed people into thinking that you should feel angry and you should do this. And in fact, they've enslaved them. And maybe enslave them to be more enslaved than they were before before civil rights or whatever. Or, you could persecute, you could hold people back from jobs and all sorts of stuff, even, eating places, all sorts of, if you knew that they had a different belief or they had a different color skin or different nationality or something, you could actually, but, now that we're not under those bonds, well, we just all should use what we have, right? Militaries should convince people rather than force them into a war. Because certainly one of the things that we've seen in the past is that willing soldiers, whether it's through money or because of cause, have been a lot more effective. And work and stuff like this, there should be options for work. But there also shouldn't be this, well, if people can work for a living, let's not have them work for a living if they don't want to work for a living. They should be able to sit around and play video games all day long. It's like, no, that's not how it works either. But certainly they can deal with the consequences of not working if that's their choice. I'm certainly aware that by people getting older or other means people become disabled, or they were disabled to start with, and page 255 has an illustration of a chicken being hatched in someone's armpit to prove a theory. And I guess I said it the wrong way, but I'm not going to ruin any conclusions with that one. And then we have that story, Super Mumps, which reminds me in particular some things that were said in 2019, some things that were said and pushed even more as time goes on. Some people believe in overpopulation, but I don't think there's any indication that the world can't multiply its population and do even better with the resources. But certainly that idea being out there allows some people to operate certain schemes. And it's not for the better of the world. It's for them. It's for their constituents, which sometimes are the real bosses. On 262, you have a man who is not disturbed by his wife when he's in meditation, but actually it seems to bring about the level of experience that he was looking for. And you have a ape woman who doesn't know what to do about what has been presented to her. Beyond the Nostrils of Nuit tells us about magical correspondence and the use of remnants of events towards further or future magical purposes. Page 265 reminds me of the whole thing about the feminist movement and the forces behind the feminist movement, and how it tends not to be a reflection of valuing women as women in their difference. And of course we can pretty much find that it was more or less started by men. I mean, you have women writers and stuff like this, but that's not the same thing. In reference to Shamgar, we have the transformation and development of the quest and hinting at what that does in regards to temple furniture. And I'm reminded as much as anything, not only of the Bible stories of the Ark of the Covenant being moved, but I'm reminded of how the stone at Mecca had also been moved out of its place. But in the case of the stone at Mecca, it wasn't about the cube, or if part of the cube, if the stone was there or not. All the ritual elements of the place remained the same. Of course, that being a psychological diagram to an even greater extent than what you see in the Bible listed. Of course, if you look at the candlestick and, okay, the knobs, how many branches? So 12 branches on 7 knobs. 12 knobs on each of the branches of that menorah and some other stuff. So more or less you have the same, but in a not as quick to understand way. And, the biblical temple is not as complete in its details, you could say, as far as the circle and all that. And certain features within, like the curved wall and the standing places, and why are these pillars positioned here rather than just arranging to mark out the points of the seasons. Page 270 has an illustration about self-righteousness, right? But it also kind of makes you think about, well, is it false self-righteousness, or is it that certain things within certain contexts, or certain things of those categories within those contexts are holy, sacred? But if they're just for themselves and no principle, no consciousness involved, then, yeah, then they are the Black Brotherhood, right? Of course, the sayings of Master Gu make you think of such things as regarding those in a higher station and a lower station. And of course, the point that I would make there is that when it comes to deeds and belief, look to those with more, and this is something you can do. When in material things, or mental abilities or whatever, you look at them and say, well, this is, I'm glad I'm not as low, right? But then again, it's what you do with your own mental abilities and stuff like that, so you can become even higher than those who seem like they have a lot. If you do your best and they do less than their best, how things exactly judge out, you don't know all the details. Hermetic yoga beyond the middle pillar are similar in a way to the seventh ray ones, but it's more about a continuous narrative, more or less, even though the articles may be different within them.